there's a wonderful example then of the two sides of the coin, because indeed in Acts 17 we are going to be judged by Jesus. And he says in that same chapter, John 12, that our listener there quoted, or was it John 5 he was quoting, but the same idea, John 12. Yes, he says there, the words that I speak to you will be your judge in the last day. Doesn't he say that? It's in the same chapter. That's the same as Acts 17, where the words of Jesus are the criterion. It's a very important and excellent question, this one. The point is that at that time, he doesn't execute judgment. That doesn't mean that he won't ever, because he is the judge under God's supervision, of course. And the critical standard for all of us, and this is what's so very much missing in much of evangelicalism, the teachings of Jesus. I want to read in connection with your question here an amazing statement from a clergyman, Kennedy of Coral Ridge Ministries, I think, now deceased. But you'll be astonished, I hope, at this statement. It points to a very serious flaw in the system. He said this: many people today think that the essence of Christianity is Jesus' teachings, but that is not so. If you read the Apostle Paul's letters, which make up most of the New Testament, you'll see there's almost no reference to the teachings of Jesus. Throughout the rest of the New Testament, there's little reference to the teachings of Jesus. And in the Apostles' Creed, he says, James Kennedy says, the most universally held Christian creed, there's no reference to the teaching of Jesus. There's also no reference to the example of Jesus in the creed, he says. Only 2 days in the life of Jesus are mentioned: his death, his resurrection, the day of his birth. Christianity, says Dr. James Kennedy, and I must protest with all the sincerity I can muster, that this is fundamentally false. Christianity, he says, centers not in the teaching of Jesus, but in the person of Jesus as incarnate God, who came into the world to take on himself our guilt and die in our place. That is amazing in view of Jesus' own statements there in John 12, at the summation of his ministry, chapter 12 of John, to be read very often. Jesus raised his voice for special emphasis and protested the fact that we're going to be judged by his teachings. 1 Timothy 6:3 says you're going to have to bring these texts to your children, to your friends, all the time. 1 Timothy 6:3 says, if anybody comes to you and doesn't bring the teachings of Jesus, watch out. You're being deceived. This is repeated in 2 John 7-9. These are verses which you're going to have to teach everywhere. I say humorously to our students, you need to preach these 4 or 5 times every Sunday, because they're missing from the consciousness of so many churchgoers. 2 John 7-9, he who comes to you and doesn't bring the teaching of Jesus is, so to speak, Antichrist. Jesus cannot be related to apart from his words. Throw in another excellent verse, Isaiah 53:11. By the servant, the suffering servant's knowledge, he, the suffering servant, will make many people right. It's actually Daniel 12, verse 3. Those who have insight and teaching will make people right. Not just the death and resurrection of Jesus, central, of course, as those items also are. There's another quote I have in front of me here where somebody points out that Islam is based on the teaching of Muhammad. Buddhism is based on the teachings of the Buddha. And this, Dr. Harold O.J. Brown, in a book called Heresy, says, Christian faith, I can barely bear to read this, but this is what he says. Christian faith is not belief in the teaching of Jesus, but in what is taught about him. And then he scoffs at the so-called liberals who think that you're supposed to believe what Jesus believed, which is correct. And he says that's not the truth. It very much is the truth. You cannot have Jesus without his words. That's the tragedy against which Jesus warned with such passion in Matthew 7. Multitudes will say, Lord, look at all the things we did for you in your name, only to be discarded. And the context there is belief in his teachings, the Sermon on the Mount particularly, and of course his kingdom gospel, which is given for the salvation of the entire world, first to the Jews and then later equally in the Great Commission to the whole world.